Commander Sarah Mitchell stood on the flight deck of the USS Intrepid, watching the last F-18 Super Hornet disappear into the stormy Atlantic sky. The salt spray stung her face as she gripped the safety rail, her knuckles white against the metal. 23 years of naval service, and it was all ending like this. Not with honor, not with a ceremony, but with disgrace and exile. The wind whipped her short auburn hair as she remembered the meeting in Admiral Harrison's quarters just 3 hours earlier. His cold gray eyes had shown no mercy, no recognition of her years of dedication to the Navy. The man who had once been her mentor, who had guided her through the ranks, had become her executioner. "Commander Mitchell," he had said, his voice as rigid as steel, "your actions during the Syrian operation have been deemed reckless and insubordinate. You deliberately disobeyed direct orders and endangered American lives." Sarah had stood at attention, her jaw clenched. "Sir, with respect, I saved those civilians. The intelligence was wrong about the compound being empty. The intelligence was classified above your pay grade, Commander. You had no right to question it, and you had no authority to abort the mission." Admiral Harrison had leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with disappointment. "I trained you better than this, Sarah. I expected more from you." The use of her first name had cut deeper than any formal reprimand could have. This wasn't just about military protocol. This was personal. Admiral Harrison felt betrayed, and in the Navy, betrayal was unforgivable. "You're being transferred off this carrier immediately," he had continued. "I'm recommending you for early retirement. Your naval career is over." Now, as Sarah packed her belongings in her cramped quarters, she could hear the whispers from the crew. Word traveled fast on a carrier, and everyone knew about her fall from grace. Officers who had once sought her advice now avoided eye contact. Sailors who had respected her leadership looked away when she passed. Lieutenant Commander Jake Rodriguez knocked on her open door. Jake had been her second-in-command for 2 years, a brilliant tactical officer with a quick smile and unwavering loyalty. His face was somber as he entered. "Ma'am, I wanted to say goodbye before you left," he said quietly. "And I wanted you to know that what you did in Syria was right. Those intelligence reports were fabricated." Sarah looked up from her duffel bag, surprised. "What are you talking about, Jake?" "I've been doing some digging since the operation. The compound wasn't empty like they claimed it was going to be after the strike. There were 43 civilians inside, including 12 children. If you hadn't aborted that mission, they would all be dead right now." The weight of his words settled on Sarah's shoulders. She had acted on instinct that day, something in her gut telling her the intelligence was wrong. When she saw the children's toys scattered in the courtyard through her binoculars, she had made the split-second decision to call off the airstrike. Why would Admiral Harrison have false intelligence? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jake's expression darkened. "There are rumors, ma'am. Talk about defense contractors pushing for military action to justify weapons sales. Some people think certain operations are being orchestrated not for national security, but for profit." Sarah felt sick. The Navy she had devoted her life to, the institution she had served with honor and pride, was being corrupted from within. And Admiral Harrison, the man she had once admired, was either part of it or willfully blind to it. "Jake, you need to be careful who you share these suspicions with," Sarah warned. "If what you're suggesting is true, then speaking up could end your career too. With respect, ma'am, maybe some things are more important than careers." Sarah finished packing and shouldered her bag. As she walked through the corridors of the carrier for the last time, memories flooded back. Her first deployment as a young ensign, nervous and eager to prove herself. The day she made lieutenant commander and felt like she could conquer the world. The countless hours spent training, studying, sacrificing everything for the Navy. She passed the mess hall, where she had shared meals with her fellow officers, debating strategy and sharing stories from home. She walked by the briefing room, where she had presented countless mission plans, each one carefully crafted to protect American interests while minimizing casualties. Every corner of this ship held a piece of her life. The helicopter that would take her to shore was warming up on the flight deck. As Sarah climbed aboard, she caught sight of Admiral Harrison watching from the bridge. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. She saw something flicker in his expression, regret, perhaps, or doubt. But then he turned away, and the moment was gone. The helicopter lifted off, and the USS Intrepid grew smaller below. Sarah pressed her face to the window, watching her home for the past 5 years disappear into the gray Atlantic. The crew on deck looked like ants, and she wondered if any of them would remember her kindly, or if her name would become a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying orders. As they flew toward Norfolk Naval Base, Sarah's mind raced. Jake's words echoed in her thoughts. If the intelligence had been fabricated, if her instincts had been right, then her exile wasn't punishment for insubordination. It was punishment for doing the right thing. The realization filled her with a cold fury. Landing at Norfolk felt surreal. After years of living on a carrier, solid ground seemed strange and unforgiving beneath her feet. She was met by Captain Stevens from personnel, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who looked perpetually uncomfortable. "Commander Mitchell," he said formally, "you're to report for debriefing at 0800 tomorrow. Your retirement paperwork is being processed." "Captain, I'd like to request a formal investigation into the Syrian operation," Sarah said. "I have reason to believe the intelligence was compromised." Captain Stevens' face went pale. "Commander, I'd advise against pursuing that line of inquiry. Your situation is already delicate. It will be best if you focused on your transition to civilian life." The warning was clear. Keep quiet, accept your fate, and walk away. But Sarah had never been good at following advice when her conscience was involved. "I understand, Captain. I'll consider my options." That night, in a sterile BOQ room that felt nothing like home, Sarah stared at the ceiling and wondered what came next. She had no civilian job prospects, no family waiting for her. The Navy had been her life. But Jake's revelation had planted a seed of determination. If the Navy was being corrupted, if operations were being manufactured for profit rather than security, then someone needed to expose it. She thought about the children in that Syrian compound, playing in their courtyard just minutes before what should have been their death. She thought about all the other operations she had participated in over the years, wondering how many had been based on lies. The weight of potential complicity pressed down on her chest like a physical force. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began typing. If Admiral Harrison thought exiling her would silence her, he was wrong. She started documenting everything she could remember about the Syrian operation, the suspicious timing of the intelligence, the pressure from higher command to execute quickly, the convenient excuses when questions were raised. As dawn broke over Norfolk, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't go quietly into retirement. She wouldn't let the corruption in her beloved Navy continue unchallenged. Admiral Harrison had exiled her from the carrier, but he hadn't broken her spirit. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had memorized years ago, but never thought she would use. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Washington Post Investigative Desk, this is Rebecca Martinez." Sarah took a deep breath. "Ms. Martinez, my name is Commander Sarah Mitchell, U.S. Navy. I have a story you need to hear about corruption in military operations and fabricated intelligence. But I need your word that you'll protect my identity until I'm ready to go public." There was a pause. "Commander, this is a serious allegation. Are you prepared for the consequences of what you're suggesting?" Sarah looked out her window at the naval base, at the ships, and sailors who represented everything she had once believed in. "Yes, ma'am. I'm prepared. The truth needs to come out, no matter what it costs me." As she began to tell her story to the journalist, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Admiral Harrison had tried to end her career, but he had inadvertently given her something more powerful than any military position: the freedom to fight for what was right without the constraints of rank and protocol. The war for truth was just beginning, and Commander Sarah Mitchell had finally found her new mission. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's conversation with Rebecca Martinez, and the investigative journalist had been thorough in her background research. They met at a small coffee shop in downtown Norfolk, far from a naval base and prying eyes. Rebecca was a sharp woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. "I've been digging into your claims, Commander," Rebecca said quietly, sliding a manila folder across the table. "What I've found is disturbing, but I need more evidence before we can publish anything." Sarah opened the folder and found copies of classified documents, financial records, and communication logs. Her hands trembled slightly as she recognized the patterns Rebecca had uncovered: a web of connections between defense contractors, high-ranking military officials, and fabricated intelligence reports. "How did you get these?" Sarah asked. I have sources throughout the military and defense industry. People who are concerned about what they're seeing but afraid to speak up. Rebecca leaned forward. The Syrian operation wasn't an isolated incident. I found at least 6 other missions in the past 2 years where intelligence appears to have been manufactured or manipulated. Sarah felt sick. The scope of the corruption was far worse than she had imagined. What do you need from me? Names, dates, specific conversations. Anything you can provide that will help us build an ironclad case. Rebecca's expression was serious. But I have to warn you, once we publish this story, there's no going back. The Navy will come after you with everything they have. That evening, Sarah sat in her temporary apartment, surrounded by files and documents she had quietly copied over her years of service. Her laptop screen glowed as she typed detailed accounts of every suspicious operation she could remember. The work was exhausting, forcing her to relive missions where she had unknowingly participated in what might have been elaborate deceptions. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jake. Need to talk. Urgent. Meet me at the pier tomorrow at 0600. Sarah's heart raced. Jake was still on the Intrepid, and any communication between them could be monitored. If he was reaching out, something significant had happened. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the pier to find Jake pacing nervously. His usually neat uniform was rumpled, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept. "Ma'am, we have a problem," he said without preamble. "Admiral Harrison knows about your investigation." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Ow, I'm not sure, but yesterday he called me into his quarters. Started asking questions about my loyalty, whether I had been in contact with you." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "He offered me a promotion to full commander if I could provide information about your activities." "What did you tell him?" "I played dumb. Said I hadn't heard from you since you left the ship. But ma'am, he knows. And if he's offering bribes for information about you, then whatever you've uncovered has them scared." Sarah nodded grimly. She had expected this eventually, but it was happening faster than she had hoped. "Jake, you need to distance yourself from me. I won't let my investigation destroy your career too. With respect, ma'am, that's not your decision to make." Jake's voice was firm. "I've been thinking about what you said, about some things being more important than careers. I want to help." Before Sarah could respond, Jake pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "I've been copying files from the ship's computer systems. Communication logs, mission briefs, financial records. Some of this stuff goes back 5 years. Sarah stared at the small device. "Jake, if they catch you with this, it's not just the end of your career. It's court-martial and prison time." "I know, but I keep thinking about those kids in Syria and all the other operations where the intelligence didn't add up. How many people have died because someone wanted to pad a defense contract?" Sarah took the flash drive with shaking hands. The weight of it seemed enormous for such a small object. "I need you to be smart about this. Don't take any more risks. If Admiral Harrison is watching me, he's watching you too." That afternoon, Sarah met with Rebecca Martinez again, this time in a secure location recommended by the journalist. Rebecca's eyes widened as she examined the contents of Jake's flash drive. "This is incredible," Rebecca murmured, scrolling through files on her laptop. These communication logs show direct coordination between Admiral Harrison and executives from Nexus Defense Systems. They were planning operations specifically to field test new weapon systems. Sarah felt nauseated. "You're saying American military operations were being used as product demonstrations?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. And look at this." Rebecca pointed to a financial document. "Admiral Harrison has received over $2 million in consulting fees from various defense contractors over the past 3 years. The pieces were falling into place, painting a picture of corruption that went to the very heart of the military leadership Sarah had once trusted. Admiral Harrison wasn't just complicit in the deception. He was orchestrating it. "We need to be extremely careful how we proceed," Rebecca warned. "These people have resources and connections throughout the government. They'll try to discredit us, or worse." That night, Sarah was walking to her car after dinner when she noticed a black SUV following her. Her naval training kicked in, and she took a circuitous route home, confirming that she was indeed being tailed. The reality of her situation crystallized. She wasn't just fighting a battle for truth, she was in actual danger. She called Rebecca from payphone. "They're watching me. Professional surveillance. I was afraid this might happen. You need to lay low for a while. I'm going to accelerate our timeline and start working on the story immediately." The next few days were tense and isolating. Sarah barely left her apartment, communicating with Rebecca only through encrypted messaging apps. She continued documenting everything she could remember, building a comprehensive timeline of corruption and deception. On Thursday evening, her phone rang. The caller ID showed Jake's number, but when she answered, Admiral Harrison's voice came through the speaker. "Commander Mitchell, I think it's time we had a conversation." Sarah's mouth went dry. "Admiral, where's Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez?" "He's safe for now, but his future depends very much on the choices you make in the next few hours." Harrison's voice was calm, almost casual. "I'm at the Norfolk Marriott, room 1247. Come alone, and come quickly." Sarah's hand shook as she ended the call. Jake was in danger because of her investigation. The Admiral was using him as leverage, and she couldn't abandon him to save herself. She left her apartment building through a back exit, taking extreme precautions to avoid the surveillance team. The drive to the hotel felt like the longest of her life, her mind racing through possible scenarios. Admiral Harrison was desperate enough to resort to kidnapping, which meant her investigation was closer to the truth than even she had realized. The hotel elevator seemed to crawl upward. When she reached the 12th floor, Sarah found the hallway empty except for two men in dark suits standing near room 1247. They nodded as she approached, and one of them opened the door. Admiral Harrison sat in a wingback chair, looking older and more tired than she had ever seen him. Jake was on the couch across from him, unharmed but clearly shaken. The Admiral gestured for Sarah to sit. "Sarah, you've caused quite a stir," Harrison said wearily. "Do you have any idea what you're playing with?" "I'm playing with the truth, Admiral. Something the Navy used to value." Harrison laughed bitterly. "The truth? The truth is that the world is more complicated than your black and white morality allows for. Do you think American interests are protected by following rules written for a simpler time? I think American interests are protected by honor and integrity, not by manufacturing wars for profit." "Profit?" Harrison leaned forward. "You think this is about money?" "Sarah, the defense contractors aren't pulling our strings. We're using them. Every operation, every field test, every conflict we orchestrate strengthens American military superiority. Do you want China or Russia to have the most advanced weapons systems?" Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "You're justifying starting wars to test weapons?" "I'm justifying maintaining global stability through American dominance. Sometimes that requires difficult choices." Harrison's voice hardened. "Choices that young idealists like you can't understand. What about the civilians? What about the children who would have died in Syria if I hadn't stopped that strike? Acceptable losses in service of a greater good." Harrison stood and walked to the window. "But you wouldn't accept that, would you? You had to play the hero." Sarah felt a surge of anger. Those children weren't acceptable losses. They were human beings with families and dreams and futures. And because of your sentimentality, Nexus Defense Systems lost a $50 billion contract with the Pentagon. Do you know what that means for American military preparedness? The conversation continued for over an hour, with Harrison alternating between threats and attempts to justify the corruption Sarah had uncovered. He offered her reinstatement, a promotion, even a position in his inner circle if she would abandon her investigation. "You trained me better than this, Admiral," Sarah finally said, throwing his earlier words back at him. "You taught me that the Navy's highest duty is to the Constitution and the American people, not to defense contractors and weapons manufacturers." Harrison's face darkened. "I also taught you about loyalty and following orders. And I also learned about honor and integrity, apparently from better sources than you did." The meeting ended with Harrison making it clear that Sarah had 24 hours to cease her investigation and disappear quietly, or face consequences that would extend beyond her own life. As she and Jake left the hotel, Sarah realized that her fight for truth had become something much more dangerous. "Ma'am," Jake said quietly as they walked to their cars, "he's not bluffing about the consequences. These people have killed to protect their secrets." Sarah looked at her young colleague, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "Then, we better make sure our story comes out before they can stop us." The war was escalating, and Sarah knew the next move would determine not just her fate, but the future of military integrity itself. Sarah and Jake drove in separate directions from the hotel, following a prearranged plan to avoid being tracked together. They would meet at a safe house Rebecca Martinez had arranged, an isolated cabin in the Virginia mountains owned by a retired Navy SEAL who had grown disillusioned with military corruption. As Sarah navigated the winding mountain roads, her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Rebecca. Story ready for publication. Need final confirmation from you before we go live. This will change everything. The weight of the moment settled on Sarah's shoulders. Once the story broke, there would be no hiding, no backing down, no way to protect herself or Jake from the inevitable retaliation. But the alternative, allowing the corruption to continue, letting more operations be manufactured for profit, was unthinkable. She arrived at the cabin to find Rebecca already there with Jake and another man she didn't recognize. He was tall and lean with weathered features and sharp blue eyes that spoke of years in combat zones. "Commander Mitchell," the man said, extending his hand, "I'm Master Chief Petty Officer Thomas Kane, retired. Rebecca tells me you're fighting the good fight." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and steady gaze. "Master Chief, I appreciate you helping us, but you should know this could get dangerous." Kane smiled grimly. "Ma'am, I've been in dangerous situations before. The difference is this time I'm fighting for something that actually matters." Rebecca pulled out her laptop and showed Sarah the final draft of the investigative piece. The headline read, "Blood Money: How Defense Contractors and Corrupt Naval Officers Manufactured Wars for Profit." The article was comprehensive, detailing not just the Syrian operation, but a pattern of fabricated intelligence and orchestrated conflicts dating back 5 years. "The evidence is overwhelming," Rebecca explained. "We have financial records, communication logs, testimony from multiple sources. Admiral Harrison and at least a dozen other high-ranking officers have been taking millions in kickbacks while American servicemen and women die in manufactured conflicts." Sarah read through the article, her stomach churning as she saw the full scope of the conspiracy laid out in black and white. Jake had risked everything to gather this evidence, and Rebecca had connected dots that painted a picture of systematic betrayal of military values. "There's something else," Rebecca said quietly. "I've been contacted by other officers who want to come forward. Word is spreading through the military community that someone is finally willing to challenge this corruption." Jake looked up from his own copy of the article. "Ma'am, we're not just exposing Admiral Harrison. This story names names, shows bank records, proves coordination between military leadership and defense contractors. When this breaks, it's going to trigger congressional investigations, criminal prosecutions, maybe even a complete overhaul of military procurement." Before Sarah could respond, Kane's phone buzzed. He answered it tersely, his expression growing darker with each word. "Roger that. We're secure here." He hung up and turned to the group. "That was one of my contacts at Norfolk. Admiral Harrison has issued arrest warrants for both of you. Treason, espionage, theft of classified materials." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "He's moving faster than we expected, which means we need to move faster too," Rebecca said, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard. "I'm sending this story to my editor right now. We'll have it published online within the hour." "Wait," Sarah said, her voice heavy with the weight of decision. "Once you publish this, there's no going back. Jake's career is over, and we'll both likely face court-martial regardless of how justified our actions were." Jake met her eyes steadily. "Ma'am, you saved those kids in Syria by trusting your instincts. Trust them again now. This story needs to be told." Sarah took a deep breath and nodded to Rebecca. "Publish it." As Rebecca sent the story to the Washington Post, Kane was busy preparing the cabin for potential visitors. "If Admiral Harrison has issued arrest warrants, he'll have federal marshals looking for you within hours. We need to be ready to move." The next 2 hours were a blur of activity. Rebecca coordinated with her editors as the story went through final fact-checking and legal review. Kane monitored law enforcement communications through contacts in various agencies. Sarah and Jake prepared statements for the inevitable media interviews and congressional hearings that would follow. At exactly 6:47 p.m. Eastern Time, the story broke online. Within minutes, Sarah's phone was buzzing with calls from reporters, other military officers, and unknown numbers. The story was spreading across social media, being shared and discussed by thousands of people who were outraged by the revelations. "It's working," Rebecca said, monitoring the story's reception. "The Pentagon has already issued a statement saying they're taking the allegations seriously and launching an internal investigation." But their celebration was short-lived. Kane's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from one of his contacts. Multiple federal vehicles heading up the mountain road. You have maybe 10 minutes. Kane was already in motion, gathering their essential materials and preparing to evacuate. There's a back trail that leads down to a secondary road. My truck is parked there. We need to move now. As they quickly packed, Sarah caught a glimpse of the television news. Her own photograph was displayed alongside Jake's as breaking news banners proclaimed Navy officers wanted for treason and military corruption scandal rocks Pentagon. They slipped out the back of the cabin just as the first federal vehicles appeared on the main road below. The mountain trail was treacherous in the growing darkness, but Kane led them confidently through terrain he obviously knew well. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked as they reached Kane's truck. "I have friends in the veteran community who don't appreciate what's been done to our military," Kane replied, starting the engine. "There are people willing to help, but we need to be smart about it." As they drove through the night, Rebecca was on her phone constantly, coordinating with her editors and tracking the story's impact. "The president has ordered a full DOD investigation," she reported. "Congress is calling for immediate hearings. Admiral Harrison has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Their story was having the impact they had hoped for, but she knew Admiral Harrison and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight. Corrupt officials with access to military resources were dangerous enemies. They arrived at another safe house as dawn was breaking, a farm owned by a retired Marine colonel who had served with Kane in Afghanistan. Colonel Maria Santos greeted them with coffee and grim news. "The Navy has frozen your assets and revoked your security clearances," she told Sarah and Jake. "They're painting you as traitors who sold classified information to foreign agents." "That's exactly what we expected," Sarah replied. "They have to discredit us to undermine the story." "But it's not working," Rebecca said, checking her laptop. "More officers are coming forward. I got 3 admirals and at least a dozen commanders who want to provide testimony about corruption they've witnessed." Colonel Santos poured coffee for everyone. "You've started something important here, but you need to understand the forces arrayed against you. Defense contractors have billions of dollars at stake. Corrupt military officers are facing prison time. They'll use every resource available to destroy you." As if to emphasize her point, the morning news was dominated by character assassination attempts against Sarah and Jake. Military officials were describing them as disgruntled officers with psychological problems. Defense contractors were issuing statements calling the allegations fabricated attacks on American defense capabilities. "They're trying to bury the evidence under personal attacks," Jake observed. "Classic disinformation tactics." But for every attack piece that aired, there were also interviews with military ethics experts who praised Sarah's courage in exposing the corruption. Veterans groups were rallying to support them. Congressional leaders from both parties were demanding full investigations. Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, she heard the voice of Admiral Patricia Chun, someone she had served with years earlier and had always respected. "Sarah, this is Pat Chun. I'm calling to let you know that not everyone in the Navy leadership supports what's been done to you. Admiral Chun, it's good to hear from you, but you should be careful about associating with Sarah. Stop. You did the right thing. I've been watching this corruption for years, documenting it, trying to find a way to expose it without destroying my career. You found a way." Admiral Chin's words provided hope, but also revealed the depth of the problem. If high-ranking officers had been aware of the corruption but felt powerless to address it, then the institutional rot went even deeper than Sarah had realized. "Admiral, are you willing to testify about what you've witnessed?" "I'm preparing a statement for Congress right now. So are several other flag officers. Your courage has given the rest of us permission to speak up." As the day progressed, it became clear that Sarah and Jake's actions had triggered an avalanche. The initial story was just the beginning. Rebecca was working with other journalists to expose additional layers of corruption. Congressional investigators were demanding access to classified files. International allies were questioning American military operations they had supported based on now-suspect intelligence. But Admiral Harrison wasn't finished. That evening, Kane received word that federal agents had raided Sarah's apartment, her parents' home, and Jake's quarters on the Intrepid. The message was clear: surrender or face escalated consequences. "They're getting desperate," Colonel Santos observed, "which makes them more dangerous." Sarah stared out the farmhouse window at the peaceful countryside, thinking about how different her life had been just a month earlier. She had been a respected naval officer with a clear career path and unwavering faith in her institution. Now she was a fugitive, branded a traitor by the organization she had served faithfully for over 2 decades. But she had no regrets. The children in Syria were alive because she had trusted her instincts. Other military operations had been exposed as manufactured conflicts. The corruption that had infected her beloved Navy was finally being brought to light. Jake joined her at the window. "Ma'am, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just followed orders that day in Syria?" Sarah considered the question. Those children would be dead, Admiral Harrison's corruption would have continued, and we'd all be complicit in a system that values profit over human life. No, Fake. I don't wonder about that at all. As night fell, they prepared for what would certainly be the most challenging phase of their fight. The story was out, investigations were beginning, but their enemies still held significant power and resources. The battle for military integrity was far from over. The morning of the 3rd day at Colonel Santos' farm brought unexpected news. Kane burst into the kitchen where Sarah, Jake, and Rebecca were planning their next moves. His face was pale with shock. "Turn on the news," he said urgently, grabbing the remote. "Something's happened." The television screen filled with breaking news coverage from the Atlantic Ocean. A reporter stood on the deck of a Coast Guard vessel, the wind whipping her hair as she spoke into the microphone. "This is truly unprecedented," the reporter was saying. "The nuclear submarine USS Nevada has surfaced in international waters and is refusing orders to return to port. The submarine's commanding officer, Captain David Morrison, has issued a statement declaring the vessel's independence from what he calls corrupt military leadership." Sarah felt her heart stop. She knew Captain Morrison. They had served together briefly 5 years earlier. He was a principled officer with an impeccable service record, not someone given to reckless actions. The news coverage continued with footage of the massive submarine sitting on the surface of the Atlantic, its crew visible on the deck. A Pentagon spokesman appeared on screen, looking shaken as he tried to downplay the situation. "The Department of Defense is in communication with the USS Nevada and expects this matter to be resolved quickly and peacefully," the spokesman said. "This appears to be a misunderstanding that will be clarified through proper channels." Rebecca was furiously typing on her laptop, pulling up more information about the submarine and its captain. "This is incredible," she murmured. "A nuclear submarine in open defiance of naval command. It's never happened before in U.S. history." Jake was staring at the television in disbelief. "Ma'am, you realize what this means? Our story about corruption has sparked something much bigger than we imagined." Before anyone could respond, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown, but something told her to answer it. "Commander Mitchell, this is Captain Morrison. I believe we need to talk." Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. "Captain, what are you doing out there? What you been doing, Sarah?" "Fighting for the truth. Your investigation exposed corruption that goes far deeper than anyone realized. When Admiral Harrison tried to order my submarine to launch a strike against a civilian target in the South China Sea, based on what I now know was fabricated intelligence, I couldn't follow through." The weight of Morrison's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. They ordered a nuclear strike, a limited tactical strike, they called it, against what they claimed was a Chinese military facility. But my intelligence officer did some digging, and we determined it was actually a research station with over 200 civilian scientists. Sarah closed her eyes, imagining the catastrophe that had been narrowly averted. "Captain, you're in incredible danger out there. They'll send other submarines, surface vessels, maybe even aircraft to force you back to port. Let them try," Morrison said grimly. "I have 150 crew members who are as disgusted with this corruption as I am. We've declared the USS Nevada an independent vessel until Congress completes a full investigation of military leadership." The implications were staggering. A nuclear submarine in revolt against the U.S. Navy was an international incident of unprecedented proportions. Foreign nations would be scrambling to understand what was happening. The submarine's nuclear weapons made the situation exponentially more complex and dangerous. Rebecca was monitoring news feeds from around the world. "This is being covered by every major news organization on the planet," she reported. "The stock market is in freefall. NATO allies are demanding explanations. Russia and China are moving naval assets to monitor the situation." Colonel Santos was pacing the kitchen, her military mind analyzing the strategic implications. Captain Morrison has just created the biggest crisis in U.S. military history. This will force Congress to act immediately on the corruption allegations. Sarah's phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed the number for the U.S. Capitol building. Commander Mitchell, this is Senator Patricia Hawkins, chairwoman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. We need you in Washington immediately. Senator, I'm currently wanted by federal authorities on trumped-up charges. Those charges have been suspended pending investigation. Congress is invoking its oversight authority, and you're being called to testify under congressional protection. A helicopter is being dispatched to your location. Sarah looked around at her companions. Jake nodded encouragingly. Rebecca was already packing her equipment to accompany them, and Colonel Santos was giving her a thumbs up. Senator, we'll be ready. 2 hours later, they were aboard a military helicopter heading toward Washington, D.C. The pilot had informed them that the airspace around the Capitol was restricted due to the ongoing crisis. Below them, they could see naval vessels heading out to sea, presumably to confront or contain the USS Nevada. The helicopter landed on the Capitol grounds, where they were met by Senator Hawkins herself, a stern woman in her 60s who had served in the Air Force before entering politics. She wasted no time with pleasantries. Commander, Lieutenant Commander, she said formally, thank you for your service to this country. The corruption you've exposed threatens the very foundation of our military. We need your testimony to understand the full scope of the problem. They were escorted into the Capitol building through a secure entrance, avoiding the media circus that had erupted outside. The halls of Congress buzzed with activity as lawmakers grappled with the unprecedented crisis of a nuclear submarine in revolt. The hearing room was packed with senators, representatives, military officials, and journalists. Sarah felt the weight of history as she and Jake were sworn in to testify under oath. This was the moment when their fight for truth would either vindicate their actions or destroy them completely. Senator Hawkins called the hearing to order. We are gathered today to examine allegations of corruption in military leadership and the unprecedented crisis involving the USS Nevada. Commander Mitchell, please tell us in your own words what led to these extraordinary circumstances. Sarah took a deep breath and began to speak. She told the story of the Syrian operation, her decision to abort the mission, her subsequent exile from the carrier, and the investigation that had uncovered systematic corruption. Her voice was steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The evidence shows that Admiral Harrison and other military leaders have been coordinating with defense contractors to manufacture conflict for the purpose of testing weapons and justifying increased military spending, Sarah testified. American servicemen and women have died in operations based on fabricated intelligence, while civilians around the world have become casualties in what amounts to deadly product demonstrations. The senators asked detailed questions about specific operations, financial transactions, and communication records. Jake provided technical testimony about how intelligence was manipulated and orders were issued for missions that served no legitimate military purpose. During a brief recess, Rebecca approached Sarah with urgent news. Captain Morrison has just released a statement from the Nevada. He's saying that he has evidence of 3 additional planned operations based on fabricated intelligence, including the nuclear strike in the South China Sea. Senator Hawkins overheard and immediately called Morrison's submarine via secure communication. The entire hearing room listened as the captain's voice came through the speakers from his submarine in the Atlantic. Senators, my crew, and I took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When our own leadership becomes corrupted by greed and power, when they order us to kill innocent civilians for profit, we have a duty to resist. Captain Morrison, Senator Hawkins said gravely, you understand that your actions constitute mutiny under military law? Senator, I understand that following illegal orders would constitute a war crime under international law. I choose to honor my oath to the Constitution rather than to corrupt leadership. The hearing continued for hours with testimony from other military officers who had witnessed corruption, defense contractors who admitted to paying bribes, and Pentagon officials who tried to minimize the scope of the problems. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the presence of the Nevada in open revolt gave urgency to every word spoken. As the day wore on, news came that other military units were beginning to voice support for Captain Morrison's actions. 3 destroyers had refused orders to intercept the Nevada. Air Force squadrons were grounding themselves rather than participate in operations they considered illegitimate. The military was beginning to fracture along lines of loyalty to either corrupt leadership or constitutional principles. Admiral Harrison, flanked by lawyers, was called to testify in the evening session. He was defiant, claiming that everything he had done was in service of American interests and that the accusations against him were fabricated by disgruntled subordinates seeking to damage national security. Senator Hawkins, Harrison said in his defense, Commander Mitchell was relieved of duty for insubordination and poor judgment. Her allegations are the desperate acts of a failed officer seeking revenge. Sarah felt her anger rising, but she forced herself to remain calm. The evidence spoke for itself, and Harrison's personal attacks only revealed his desperation. The hearing was interrupted when an aide rushed in with an urgent message for Senator Hawkins. She read it quickly, her face growing pale. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "I've just been informed that the President has declared a state of emergency and is invoking the Insurrection Act. Federal troops are being mobilized to address what the administration is calling an internal military rebellion." The room erupted in chaos. Representatives shouted questions, military officials spoke urgently into phones, and journalists rushed to file breaking news reports. Sarah realized that their fight for truth had triggered the greatest military crisis in American history. Jake leaned over to her. "Ma'am, I don't think any of us anticipated it would come to this." Sarah nodded grimly. The USS Nevada's Defiance had transformed their investigation from a corruption scandal into a potential civil war within the military itself. The stakes had escalated beyond anything she could have imagined when she made that fateful decision to abort the Syrian operation. As the hearing was adjourned for the night amid the chaos, Sarah wondered whether she had saved her country or helped tear it apart. The line between patriotism and treason had become blurred beyond recognition, and the resolution of this crisis would determine not just her fate, but the future of American democracy itself. The secure safe house in Georgetown, where Sarah, Jake, and Rebecca were being protected by congressional security detail, felt like the eye of a hurricane. Outside, the nation was in turmoil as the military crisis escalated by the hour. Television screens throughout the house displayed constant news coverage of what media had dubbed the Nevada crisis. It had been 48 hours since the president declared a state of emergency. The USS Nevada remained on the surface of the Atlantic, now joined by 2 destroyers and a guided missile cruiser whose crews had declared solidarity with Captain Morrison's rebellion. More troubling for the administration, several Air Force bases had effectively gone on strike, with pilots and ground crews refusing orders they believed came from compromised leadership. Sarah stood at the window, watching black SUVs patrol the street below. Congressional security had informed them that loyal military units were attempting to locate and arrest the instigators of the rebellion, despite their protection under congressional oversight authority. "The president is scheduled to address the nation in an hour," Rebecca reported, monitoring news feeds on her laptop. "According to my sources, he's under enormous pressure to resolve this crisis before it spirals into complete military breakdown." Jake was on the phone with Captain Morrison, maintaining contact through encrypted communications. "Captain says they've intercepted communications indicating Admiral Harrison is trying to coordinate a military response against the Nevada. He wants loyal units to force the submarine back to port." Sarah shook her head in disbelief. Even facing the collapse of his career and potential criminal prosecution, Admiral Harrison was still trying to use military force to solve his problems. The man who had once been her mentor had become completely corrupted by power and greed. Her phone buzzed with a call from Senator Hawkins. "Commander, we need you at the Capitol immediately. The president has agreed to meet with congressional leadership and key witnesses. Your testimony may be the only thing that can prevent this situation from deteriorating into actual armed conflict." The drive to the Capitol felt surreal. Military checkpoints dotted the streets of Washington, with nervous-looking soldiers checking identification and monitoring radio communications. The city felt like a war zone, which in many ways it had become. Inside the Capitol, Sarah was escorted to a secure conference room where the most powerful people in American government were gathered around a long table. The president sat at the head, flanked by the Secretary of Defense, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and senior congressional leaders from both parties. "Commander Mitchell," the president said as she entered, "I understand you've been at the center of this crisis from the beginning. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here. Sarah felt the weight of history as she took her seat. The decisions made in this room over the next few hours would determine whether the United States emerged from this crisis with its democratic institutions intact or descended into military chaos. Mr. President, Sarah began, what we're dealing with is the systematic corruption of military leadership by defense contractors seeking profit from manufactured conflicts. Admiral Harrison and others have been taking millions in bribes while ordering operations that serve no legitimate military purpose. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Patricia Clark, leaned forward. Commander, those are serious allegations. Do you have concrete evidence? Rebecca placed several thick folders on the table. We have financial records, communication logs, and testimony from multiple sources proving coordination between military leaders and defense contractors to create conflicts for weapons testing and increased military spending. The Secretary of Defense, Marcus Webb, looked skeptical. Even if these allegations are true, they don't justify a nuclear submarine in open rebellion against lawful authority. Sir, Jake interjected, Captain Morrison was ordered to launch a nuclear strike against a civilian research facility based on fabricated intelligence. When he investigated and discovered the target was full of innocent scientists, he refused to follow through. That's not rebellion. That's honoring his oath to avoid war crimes. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The president's face was grave as he processed the information. Are you telling me that Admiral Harrison ordered a nuclear attack against civilians? Sarah nodded. The pattern is clear, Mr. President. Operations have been escalating in scope and lethality as defense contractors push for bigger contracts. The nuclear strike would have been the ultimate field test for new weapon systems. Senator Hawkins placed additional documents on the table. Our investigation has uncovered evidence of planned operations in 12 countries over the next 2 years. The corruption isn't just about past crimes. It's about preventing future atrocities. The president stood and walked to the window overlooking the National Mall. For several minutes, he stared out at the monuments to American ideals while the room waited in tense silence. Finally, he turned back to the group. General Clark, I want Admiral Harrison and all officers named in this investigation arrested immediately. Secretary Webb, I want a complete audit of all military contracts approved in the last 5 years. Senator Hawkins, Congress has my full cooperation in investigating this corruption. Mr. President, the Secretary of Defense said carefully, what about the USS Nevada? We can't have nuclear submarines making independent decisions about following orders. The president considered this for a moment. I want to speak directly with Captain Morrison. Within minutes, a secure communication link was established with the submarine. Captain Morrison's voice filled the room through speakers, calm and professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. Mr. President, thank you for taking the time to communicate with us directly. Captain Morrison, you've placed me in an impossible position. Your actions threaten the very foundation of military discipline and chain of command. Sir, with respect, the corruption of military leadership threatened those foundations long before my submarine surfaced. We've simply made the crisis visible rather than allowing it to continue in the shadows. The president's voice was stern but not hostile. Captain, what would it take for you to return your vessel to port? Mr. President, my crew and I require 3 conditions. First, Admiral Harrison and all corrupt officers must be removed from command and arrested. Second, independent oversight of all military operations must be established to prevent future manufactured conflicts. Third, immunity for all personnel who have refused to participate in illegitimate operations. Sarah held her breath as the president considered the demands. These weren't the requests of mutinous sailors. They were the conditions of patriots trying to restore honor to their service. Captain Morrison, if I agree to these conditions, will you guarantee the immediate return of the USS Nevada to port? Yes, sir, but only after we have verification that corrupt leadership has been removed and oversight mechanisms are in place. The president looked around the room at his advisors. Secretary Webb was shaking his head, clearly opposed to negotiating with what he saw as mutineers. General Clark appeared torn between military protocol and recognition that Morrison's demands were reasonable. Congressional leaders were nodding in agreement with the submarine captain's conditions. Captain, you have my word. Admiral Harrison is being arrested as we speak. Independent oversight will be established within 48 hours. Your personnel and all others who refused illegitimate orders will receive immunity. Through the speakers, they could hear cheering from the submarine crew. Captain Morrison's voice was emotional as he responded. Thank you, Mr. President. The USS Nevada will return to port immediately. The crisis was over, but the work of rebuilding trust in military institutions was just beginning. Over the next several hours, Admiral Harrison and 17 other officers were arrested on charges ranging from corruption to conspiracy to commit war crimes. Defense contractor executives were taken into custody by federal agents. Congressional oversight committees were established to review all military operations and contracts. Sarah stood on the Capitol steps as the sun set over Washington. The city was slowly returning to normal, but she knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. The military she had loved and served faithfully had been revealed as deeply corrupted, but it was also showing its capacity for redemption through the actions of officers like Captain Morrison, who chose conscience over careerism. Jake joined her on the steps. Ma'am, what do you think happens next? I think we rebuild, Sarah said quietly. We take the lessons from this crisis and create something better. A military that serves the Constitution and the people, not defense contractors and corrupt officials. Rebecca approached them with news from her editors. The story is being called the most important military investigation in American history. But, more importantly, it's already preventing planned operations in 3 different countries where intelligence was fabricated. Sarah felt a sense of completion that had been missing since her exile from a carrier. The children she had saved in Syria were just the beginning. Countless other lives would be spared because military officers had found the courage to say no to corruption. A car pulled up to take them back to their temporary housing. As they drove through the streets of Washington, Sarah reflected on how far she had come from that day on the carrier when Admiral Harrison had branded her a failure. She had lost her military career, but she had helped save the soul of the institution she loved. Commander, Jake said as they watched the city pass by, do you think Admiral Harrison really believed he was serving American interests? Sarah considered the question. I think he started with good intentions, but power and money corrupted him. He convinced himself that the ends justified the means and lost sight of what the Navy actually stands for. Which is what, ma'am? Honor, commitment, service to something bigger than ourselves. Protection of the innocent, not exploitation of them for profit. Sarah smiled sadly. The same values that made Captain Morrison surface his submarine and risk everything to do what was right. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a letter from the new Secretary of the Navy offering her reinstatement and promotion to captain. She declined politely, choosing instead to accept a position with the Congressional Oversight Committee, ensuring that the reforms implemented in the wake of the crisis would be permanent. Jake accepted his own promotion and transferred to the new Military Ethics Command, tasked with training officers to recognize and resist corruption. Captain Morrison returned to port as promised and was reassigned to lead the reformed submarine command. Admiral Harrison was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for his role in the conspiracy. The defense contractors involved paid billions in fines and were banned from military contracts. Most importantly, independent oversight of military operations prevented the kind of manufactured conflicts that had cost so many lives. On the anniversary of the Syrian operation that had started everything, Sarah visited Arlington National Cemetery. She stood among the graves of service members who had died in operations that might have been unnecessary, manufactured for profit rather than national security. The weight of their sacrifice reminded her why the fight for truth and integrity in military service could never end. Her phone buzzed with a text message from a young naval officer she had never met. Commander Mitchell, thank you for showing us that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is disobey orders. Because of you, I knew to question the intelligence for our last operation, and we discovered it was fabricated. You saved lives you'll never know about. Sarah smiled through her tears as she walked among the headstones. Admiral Harrison had tried to exile her from the carrier to silence her conscience, but instead he had freed her to fight for something more important than any single career or institution. The USS Nevada's surface defiance had been dramatic, but the real victory was quieter. Officers throughout the military who now had permission to choose integrity over obedience, truth over convenience. The battle for military honor would continue in congressional hearing rooms and training facilities, in classified briefings and public oversight hearings. But The foundation had been laid by a submarine captain who chose to surface rather than launch an unjust strike, and by officers who remembered that their highest loyalty was not to corrupt leadership, but to the Constitution and the people they had swore to protect. Sarah's exile from the carrier had ended, but her true service to her country was just beginning.